Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you is not written in your history books, and it was never meant to reach your ears. In the hills of eastern Kentucky, there is a mine sealed by iron doors, guarded by silence, and erased from official records. Authorities will tell you it was shut down for safety reasons back in 1847, but that is a lie. The truth buried beneath those hills is far more disturbing and far more dangerous. It is the story of a family whose bloodline became a living experiment, a legacy of poison, secrecy, and unnatural survival, and once you hear it, you cannot go back to who you were before. Before we go deeper, I want to know, where are you watching this from? Drop your state in the comments below, because tonight you and I are walking into Kentucky together, into the year 1793, and into the darkest family secret America ever produced. Imagine this. A bitter winter night in the frontier wilderness. 3 men, brothers, trudging through snow into a valley no settler wanted, their breath steaming in the cold, their tools clanging softly as they dragged them behind. Their names were Caleb, Silas, and Jeremiah Hartwell. To the world, they were miners, pioneers looking for copper, but inside their bloodline was something different. A curse and an obsession. Their father had died young, his lungs blackened by years of breathing metallic dust. Their mother, killed by childbirth, her body weakened from the same invisible poison. Their family had clawed iron and copper from Pennsylvania hillsides for generations, each life shortened, each death marked by strange discolorations of the skin and trembling of the hands. Yet somehow, instead of running from this fate, the Hartwells leaned into it. They treated it as knowledge, as inheritance. Death became data, suffering became a legacy, and by the time they reached Kentucky, they were not just looking for ore, they were looking for a laboratory. That valley they chose, the locals called it Copper Basin. The rocks there glowed faintly green, veins of metal streaking through stone like veins of blood through a body. Other settlers had passed it over, too remote, too dangerous, too cursed. But to the Hartwells it was perfect. Isolation meant secrecy, and secrecy meant freedom to do what no other family dared. They built a cabin, but it wasn't just a cabin. The walls were thick stone, too thick for warmth alone. The windows were narrow, positioned like rifle slits, and the cellar beneath didn't stop at a few feet into the earth. It tunneled deep, too deep for food storage, down into the bones of the mountain itself. This wasn't a homestead. It was a fortress, a sanctuary for experiments no outsider would ever see. And then the discovery, a vein of copper so pure it shimmered like fire when struck by lantern light. A fortune waiting to be taken. But there was a problem. The copper was laced with arsenic, with lead, with mercury, metals that corrode the body from the inside out. Every strike of the pickaxe released a poison cloud. Every touch left a trace of death. They had seen it before. They knew what it meant. But instead of stopping, they smiled. This is where the story begins to turn. Because what you must understand is this. The Hartwells didn't just mine copper. They mined suffering. They studied it. They documented it. They began something in that valley that would consume not only their lives, but the lives of every man they brought into their operation. And when the doors of that mine were finally sealed in 1847, not a single Hartwell remained alive. But the records of what they did, what they learned, were too dangerous to be left in the hands of ordinary people, which is why, when those records surfaced decades later, they mysteriously vanished into federal custody, never to be seen again. You're already feeling it, aren't you? That unease in your chest, that sense that you're hearing something forbidden. That's because you are. This story has been buried for over 2 centuries, and the deeper we go, the darker it becomes. The Hartwell family did not just dig metal out of the Kentucky hills. They unearthed knowledge about pain, about poison, and about the human body's terrifying ability to adapt to suffering. Knowledge that still echoes today in ways most men will never see. And tonight, you are going to see it. The year was 1792. Kentucky had just entered the Union as the 15th state, and the frontier was alive with restless men chasing the promise of land and freedom. Families poured through the Cumberland Gap, wagons creaking, oxen straining, children crying against the cold. They came to escape poverty, to stake claims, to build futures, but among them walked three brothers who carried not hope, but hunger. The Hartwells, Caleb 34, Silas 32, Jeremiah 25. They were not farmers seeking fertile soil. They were not families chasing peace. They were predators of the earth, hunting for veins of metal like other men hunt game. Their faces told the story of generations marked by the mine, eyes ringed in shadow, skin pale and tinged faintly with the ghostly hue of copper dust. Their father, Tobias Hartwell, had been a miner too, a man who died at 43, his lungs filled with metallic ash, his hands trembling until he could no longer lift his tools. Their grandfather Ezekiel before him gone even younger, their mother Sarah dead in childbirth, her body weakened by years of exposure to poisoned air. The Hartwell name had been carved into Pennsylvania stone, and every letter of it was paid for with pain. Other men would have run from that curse, but the Hartwells did not. They studied it, they absorbed it. They saw in their father's suffering something no outsider could understand, a pattern. And where others saw tragedy, the Hartwells saw opportunity. By the time they buried Tobias, the brothers had inherited more than his tools. They had inherited his obsession, his journals filled with notes on metals, on extraction, on the way different poisons spread through the human body, pages stained by blood and ink, describing the tremors, the discoloration, the pain, not with sorrow, but with precision. And so, when the Hartwells pushed through, chased the wilderness and looked upon the copper-colored hills of Kentucky, they knew this was where they would turn their inheritance into power, not just wealth, but something darker, something lasting. The valley they chose lay hidden between ridges, where three streams converged into a basin streaked with green stone. Others had passed it by, too far from towns, too treacherous, too quiet. But to the Hartwells, its silence was an invitation. They wanted secrecy, they wanted distance, because what they intended to do was not meant for watching eyes. They built their home like men at war. The walls of their cabin were thick with stone, impossible to burn and difficult to breach. The windows were narrow, perfect for muskets, and beneath it a cellar that plunged deep into the hillside, far deeper than needed for food or storage. A hole carved not to preserve grain, but to lead them into the mountain itself. The settlers who passed by in those early years whispered that the Hartwells seemed less like pioneers and more like men preparing for a siege. They were not wrong. For a time, the Hartwells lived like shadows. They came into town rarely, speaking little, buying only what was necessary: flour, salt, whiskey. They carried themselves like men with secrets, and when locals asked about their claim, their eyes went cold. The truth is, they did not care about acceptance. They did not care about neighbors. They were building something greater than community. They were building an empire of secrecy, and everything within that valley belonged to them. And then, one strike of a pickaxe changed everything. Caleb was the first to see it. A glint in the lantern light, a seam of copper that shimmered like fire frozen in stone. When they followed it deeper, they realized what they had found. A vein so pure, so vast, it could sustain them for generations. But there was more. The copper was not ordinary. It carried a hidden element, a venom inside the wealth. Arsenic, lead, mercury, poisons woven into the treasure. The mine was not just rich, it was cursed. When men came west to claim land, they built homes of wood, quick cabins thrown up in days, meant only to keep out rain and wolves. But the Hartwells did not build like that. No, their cabin rose like a fortress, as if they knew from the very beginning that what they were hiding would invite enemies. Thick stone walls, quarried from the very hillside they planned to mine, stood against the wind like the sides of a prison. The windows were narrow slits, too small to let in light, but wide enough for a musket barrel, and beneath it all, the cellar, a tunnel system carved deep into the bedrock, far below what any settler would need for storage, a hidden artery running into the mountain's heart. This was not a home, it was a redoubt, a citadel of secrecy. Even then, the Hartwells seemed less like pioneers chasing opportunity and more like conspirators preparing for a war no one else could see. The locals noticed. Travelers who wandered too close spoke of a strange unease. the feeling of being watched from the ridgeline. The brothers were rarely seen together in town. One would come for salt or tobacco, silent and cold, while the others stayed behind to guard the claim. Their eyes gave them away, dark, calculating, never warm. People whispered that they were hiding something, but in the Kentucky wilderness of 1792, a man's land was his law, and no neighbor wanted to test men who carried themselves like soldiers in enemy territory. Why such secrecy? Why build their claim like a stronghold? The answer lay in the vein of metal they had discovered. It was not just wealth they were protecting, it was knowledge. That seam of copper shot through with arsenic and lead was more than a fortune. It was a living experiment. Every pickaxe strike released dust that poisoned lungs. Every hand that touched it carried toxins into the bloodstream. They had seen this before in their father, in their grandfather, and yet instead of fleeing from it, they recognized its value. They had come to Kentucky not to escape their family curse, but to study it. And to study suffering, you need privacy. To turn life into data, you need silence. The Hartwells understood that what they were about to do could never be shown in daylight. They would need walls thick enough to hold screams, tunnels deep enough to hide bodies, and a reputation hard enough to keep strangers away. That is why they built their home the way they did, not as a place to live, but as a place to control. Soon they began hiring men, drifters, loners, men with no families to ask questions if they went missing. These workers were led into the tunnels, given tools and told to dig. At first, they labored like any miners would, but one by one they began to disappear. Some were said to have moved on, others quit after a few weeks. The truth was far darker. Many never left the valley. The Hartwells were learning. Every man they brought in was a test subject. Every cough, every tremor, every strange discoloration of the skin was carefully observed. The ledgers they kept were not books of profit and ore weight. They were journals of human suffering. Data written in cold, meticulous detail. How long before the shaking started? How many weeks before breathing became labored? How the skin began to stain, first at the fingers, then creeping up the arms like veins of metal inside flesh. The cabin, the mine, the valley itself all became a stage for their secret project, and as their wealth grew, so did their obsession. They bought supplies but never luxuries. They hoarded knowledge instead of comfort. It was as if the mine itself had consumed them, stripping away any trace of ordinary humanity. By the winter of 1793, the Hartwell claim was no longer just a mine. It was a laboratory of pay, carved into the heart of the Kentucky wilderness. And the fortress they had built above it stood like a warning to anyone who dared wander too close. This ground does not belong to the living. It began with a single strike of iron against stone. A lantern flickered, shadows trembling on the walls of the shaft, and there it was, the gleam. Not the dull brown red of ordinary copper, but a vein that shimmered like fire trapped in rock. Caleb knelt in silence, his breath heavy, his gloved hand brushing the seam. This was wealth beyond imagining. This was the kind of find that could turn three brothers into kings of the frontier, but as the lantern light danced across that metallic seam, they saw something else. Embedded within the beauty was a shadow. The copper wasn't pure, it carried a secret, a hidden venom. Arsenic, lead, mercury, all blended together like the mine itself was alive and poisoning anyone who dared touch its veins. Most men would have cursed their luck and abandoned the claim, but the Hartwells did not, because this was not their first encounter with poisoned metal. They had grown up in its shadow, their father's lungs had rotted from it, their grandfather's bones had blackened with it, and now here it was again, staring back at them from the walls of their Kentucky shaft. Only this time, they saw not death, but design. The tests began immediately. They carried small samples of the ore back to their cabin, heating fragments in crude furnaces, watching how the fumes spread, recording how long before their skin began to itch, their heads to pound. The notes they left behind, later recovered in fragments, reveal not the fear of men facing a curse, but the excitement of scientists glimpsing discovery. Metal unusually clean, one entry reads. alloyed with natural toxins, purity increased by poison, extraction yields greater than Pennsylvania. Possible long-term tolerances? These were not miners anymore. They were researchers, and their bodies, their very bloodlines, became the laboratory. Jeremiah, the youngest, was the first to falter. After long days underground, he returned to the cabin trembling, his skin mottled with strange blue-green stains that seemed to rise from beneath the flesh itself. But instead of resting, instead of fleeing, he opened his grandfather's journal and began writing. His notes were precise, clinical. Day 12, discoloration spreading along arms, tremors disrupt hand stability, breathing difficult at dawn, appetite diminished, condition similar to father's last months. He did not beg for help. He did not record fear. He recorded data. His suffering was not misfortune. It was measurement. The brothers encouraged it. They timed his work shifts, limited his meals, and adjusted his hours underground as if fine-tuning an experiment. Caleb, the eldest, wrote with cold detachment about his younger brother's deterioration, exposure increasing efficiency of observations, symptoms progressing faster than father's, may provide predictive model for future cases. Jeremiah was not their brother anymore. He was their subject, and the Hartwell mine was not a curse, it was a crucible. The copper itself, when refined, was breathtaking. Its purity astonished merchants in Louisville. Its shine commanded prices higher than anything pulled from the earth in the frontier. But no one understood how the Hartwells were extracting it. Their tools were crude, their methods primitive, yet their shipments glowed with perfection, as though pulled from the mountain by some future technology. Officials began asking questions. How could 3 uneducated men produce ore of such quality? But the Hartwells kept to themselves, their mouths shut, their valley sealed. They would not reveal that their secret was not in the tools, but in the suffering. Because with every ingot of copper they smelted, another layer of Jeremiah's body corroded. With every shipment, his blood carried more metal, his organs keening with poison, but to the Hartwells this was proof of concept, proof that the mind did not simply kill, it transformed. Slowly, painfully, it bent the human body into something else, something tainted, something resilient, something useful. By 1794, the Hartwells were no longer simple miners in Kentucky. They had crossed a threshold most men would never dare approach. They had chosen to embrace the poison rather than escape it. They had chosen to mine knowledge as greedily as they mined copper, and in that choice, they had set themselves on a path that would not only destroy their bloodline, but leave behind a legacy so disturbing, so unnatural, that authorities would one day seal the mine with iron and bury the name Hartwell under centuries of silence. The vein glittered in the dark like a snake coiled within the earth, and the brothers knew it for what it was, both treasure and predator. But they had already made their choice. They would not run, they would feed it, with their bodies, with their workers, with their descendants. The Hartwell curse had become the Hartwell project, and in their minds, it was not death they were digging toward. It was power. It began subtly, like the whisper of a sickness that hides in the body before it strikes. Jeremiah complained of headaches after long shifts in the shaft. His hands shook when he tried to write. His breath grew short at night like something was crushing his chest from the inside. At first, the brothers dismissed it. Mining was hard. Men grew weak, but this was not weakness. This was the metal working its way into his blood. Soon the changes could not be ignored. Dark stains bloomed on his skin, first at the fingertips, then spreading up his arms in mottled waves of green and black, as if the copper itself had seeped into his veins. His lips took on a faint blue hue. His eyes grew glassy, and his movements jerky, unpredictable. But Jeremiah did not weep, did not rage. He wrote. His journal, fragments of which survived in courthouse archives until their mysterious disappearance in 1963, is not the diary of a dying man. It is a record of an experiment. The handwriting remains steady even as the tremors worsen, the tone clinical even as his flesh decays. Day 27, stains advance to elbow, tremors interfere with tool use but not with documentation, breathing increasingly shallow in mornings, appetite stable. There is no fear in these words. Only observation. And the most disturbing part, his brothers encouraged it. Caleb and Silas measured his work hours, tracked his meals, and noted how his body responded to rest, to exertion, to different diets. They treated him not as family, but as subject, as if Jeremiah's suffering was not tragedy, but opportunity. Neighbors who caught glimpses of him in this period described him as hollow-eyed, skin-marked like mold creeping up from the ground. Children whispered that he was turning into stone, but no one dared confront the Hartwells. The cabin on the ridge, with its fortress walls and narrow windows, loomed over the valley, like a watchtower, and any man who wandered too close to their tunnels did not return. By the winter of 1794, Jeremiah could no longer swing a pickaxe. His hands shook too violently, his breath rasped like wind through broken reeds, yet he insisted on going underground, insisted on feeling the air thicken with metallic dust, insisted on documenting the precise point at which his body failed. Day 63, tremors constant, grip unreliable, vision narrowing at edges, mental clarity remains intact, noted irritability in brothers at delays caused by symptoms. Even as his life crumbled, he thought like a researcher, but his body was breaking faster than even Caleb had predicted. By early 1795, he could hardly rise from his bed. His teeth loosened and fell, his gums bled without reason, and his skin took on the waxy, mottled pallor of a corpse still alive. He was 26 years old, yet to Caleb, this was not horror. This was data. Day 102. Subject unable to sustain work. Full body discoloration present, muscles deteriorating. Suggest controlled exposure for future cases to prolong study. And then came the moment that revealed the true heart of the Hartwell experiment. On a February morning, a physician arrived at the cabin. Dr. Marcus Pendleton, one of the few educated men in the region. He examined Jeremiah and saw immediately that this was no accident. This was controlled poisoning. He begged the brothers to let him take Jeremiah to Louisville for treatment, but Caleb refused. Instead, he asked the doctor questions, detailed questions. How long could a body endure such exposure? Were the symptoms reversible? What organs would be most saturated with metal? Pendleton wrote later in his private journal. The eldest brother seemed more pleased with the permanence of the damage than alarmed. I realized then they did not seek to heal. They sought to learn. By spring, Jeremiah could no longer speak without gasping. His notes, scratched shakily onto paper, grew shorter. Day 127. Vision narrowing. Metallic taste constant. Motor control failing in predictable sequence. Cognitive clarity remains. Recommend reduced intervals in future subjects. Those were his last words. He died convulsing on the dirt floor of the shaft, lips blackened, fingernails blue, the mine itself claiming the first of its architects. Caleb and Silas stood over him, not in grief, but in grim calculation. Before burying him on the ridge, Caleb cut him open, a crude autopsy, notes taken in chilling detail, copper deposits in the liver, lead staining in the bones, mercury in the brain. Jeremiah was no longer their brother, he was their first completed case study. And in that moment, the Hartwell experiment was born. The physician rode into the valley on a grey horse, expecting nothing more unusual than a sick miner. He had treated fevers, amputated crushed limbs, and stitched wounds from wild animal attacks. He thought he understood the limits of frontier suffering, but when he stepped inside the Hartwell cabin in March of 1795, he realized at once that what lay before him was not sickness. It was something carefully constructed. Jeremiah Hartwell lay on a cot against the stone wall, shivering under a coarse blanket. His skin was the first thing Pendleton noticed, mottled, stained in colors no illness could explain. Patches of deep green traced along his arms, as if veins of ore had risen through the flesh. His gums bled freely, his lips were cracked and blue, and his eyes, though clouded, still fixed with eerie sharpness on the doctor's movements. Pendleton leaned close and caught the odor. Metallic, acrid, like pennies burning in a furnace. He had smelled it before, faintly, in smelter towns, but never from a man's breath. Caleb and Silas stood silently nearby, their expressions unreadable. Pendleton began his examination, asking the usual questions. How long had the symptoms persisted? What food had he eaten? What medicines had been tried? But Caleb's answers were clipped, calculated. And soon the doctor realized he was the one being questioned. "What organs would be first to fail?" Caleb asked, his voice steady, almost curious. "Does the poison linger after death?" Silas added. "If the body adapts, can the offspring inherit tolerance?" Pendleton paused, his blood chilling. These were not the questions of grieving brothers. These were the questions of men conducting an experiment. He tried to reason with them. He explained that Jeremiah's condition was no accident. This was arsenic and heavy metal poisoning of a deliberate, sustained sort. If Jeremiah was to have any chance at all, he needed to be removed from the mine, taken to cleaner air, given proper care. But the Hartwells did not flinch. Caleb even smiled faintly, as though Pendleton had confirmed something he already knew. In his private journal, recovered decades later by county historians, Pendleton wrote, "I understood then that they did not seek his recovery. They sought his death, not as tragedy, but as record." Jeremiah coughed violently during the visit, spattering blood into a rag. Pendleton bent close to comfort him, but the younger Hartwell gripped his wrist with surprising strength. His lips parted, and he rasped words that haunted Pendleton for the rest of his days. "Write it down." The doctor realized in that moment that Jeremiah himself was complicit. His suffering had become a study, and he demanded only that it be documented. Pendleton, horrified, refused, but the brothers, notebooks already in hand, scribbled eagerly as their sibling convulsed. When Pendleton attempted to intervene, to insist that Jeremiah be moved immediately, Caleb stepped between them. His hand rested not on a weapon but on a heavy ledger bound in cracked leather. "Doctor," he said coldly, "you heal the living. We record the inevitable. Our work will outlast your practice." Pendleton fled the cabin that night, shaken, but he could not stay silent. In letters sent to colleagues in Lexington, he described the Hartwells as madmen disguised as miners, warning that their claim was not safe. But frontier law was thin. No marshal came, no inquiry followed. The valley was too remote, the family too feared. His letters disappeared into archives. His warnings were ignored. Years later, long after Pendleton himself succumbed to fever, a single surviving page of his notes surfaced. It contained only 3 sentences, scrawled in a hurried hand. "They do not mine copper, they mine flesh. The ore is not their fortune, it is their faith." The valley had always been quiet. A man could vanish into the woods there, and no one beyond his kin would notice for weeks. That was why the Hartwells chose it. But by the late summer of 1795, whispers began to drift down the Kentucky roads, hunters gone missing, peddlers failing to return, travelers who entered the ridge country and never came back. At first, the disappearances seemed ordinary enough. The frontier devoured men easily. A misstep into a ravine, a rattlesnake bite, a skirmish with raiders. But the pattern troubled those who watched closely. All of the missing had last been seen near the Hartwell property, and the Hartwells, once merely aloof, now barred their doors and guarded the trail to their mine with a zeal that drew suspicion. The truth, uncovered only in fragments of testimony decades later, is darker still. Jeremiah's death had changed the brothers. His convulsions, his discoloration, his autopsy, all of it convinced Caleb and Silas that the mine's poison was not simply a hazard, but a tool. Yet Jeremiah's death had been too swift, his data incomplete. If the Hartwell project was to continue, they needed more subjects. They could not risk themselves again, so they looked outward. The first was a trapper, a man known in the settlements for his solitude. He came to the cabin one evening with pelts to sell. The brothers welcomed him in, poured him whiskey, spoke of fair trade. He never left. Weeks later, a hunter stumbled upon a torn scrap of fur snagged on the shaft's timber bracing, the only trace. Then came a pair of travelers bound for Tennessee. They camped along the ridge and were never seen again. Silas recorded the event in a coded entry later deciphered by historians. Subjects 2 and 3, initial tolerance better than expected, respiratory collapse slower than Jeremiah's case, indicates potential variables beyond simple exposure. The Hartwells were no longer hiding their methods from themselves, they were cataloguing them. The mine had become a chamber of study, its tunnels echoing not only with the strike of pickaxes but with the ragged breaths of men forced to endure its air. Neighbors who skirted the valley reported strange sounds at night, Coughing, shouting, sometimes even singing, carried on the wind. Once a farmer claimed he saw figures moving by lantern light deep within the shaft, though the brothers swore no workers had been hired. Another reported a smell like burned metal and rotting meat drifting from the ridge. The authorities, few and far between, dismissed it all as superstition. But one man did not. A blacksmith named Owen Callahan, whose brother vanished on a trading route near the Hartwell land, rode up to the cabin in late October demanding answers. Caleb received him with eerie calm, invited him inside and closed the door. Callahan was never seen again. What remained was his hammer, found months later half buried in slag near the smelting pit. The ledger from that winter, one of the few Hartwell records preserved, contains chilling notations. Subject 4. Muscle deterioration mapped with consistency. Subject 5. Heightened resistance survived 11 days beyond expectation. Subject 6. Unexpected aggression, attempted escape, recaptured. Notes corrupted by injury during struggle. The handwriting grows steadier as the entries progress, as if Caleb's detachment hardened into something colder than science. By the dawn of 1796, the Hartwells had crossed a line from which they could never return. The mine was no longer just a claim. It was a theater of controlled suffering. Men went in as workers, wanderers, strangers. They came out, if at all, altered, tainted, their bodies etched with the same green-black stains that marked Jeremiah's flesh. Most did not come out at all. The ridge earned a name among settlers. Dead Copper Hollow. Travelers avoided it. Mothers warned children never to wander near. And yet, shipments of impossibly pure copper continued to flow from the valley, hauled by the brothers themselves to river traders who asked no questions. Wealth and silence insulated them, fear shielded them. And deep in the shaft, lantern light flickered over walls streaked with veins of poison, over tools slick with sweat and blood. The Hartwells did not mourn the disappearances. They counted them. They measured them. Each missing man was not a tragedy, but an entry. Each scream in the dark was another step in the project. The mine was fed, and it demanded more. By 1796, the name was spoken in hushed tones, Dead Copper Hollow. No one remembered exactly who coined it first, but once uttered, it spread like infection. To speak the name was to conjure the ridge in all its gloom, the narrow path winding upward through deadfall and shale, the black mouth of the mine that seemed to exhale a constant breath of cold metallic air. Travelers detoured miles out of their way rather than pass its edge. Hunters swore that deer avoided it, that even wolves gave its woods a wide berth. Birds, once common in the hollow, grew scarce. At dusk, the ridge fell too quiet, as if the very air pressed its silence into the lungs of any who dared climb it. Folklore grew quickly. Mothers warned their children that the mine was hungry, that it called to the careless and swallowed them whole. Campfire tales told of a figure who wandered the tree line at night, a man-shaped shadow with glowing eyes, said to be Jeremiah Hartwell, returned from the pit, marked forever by its poison. Others whispered that the brothers had found a way to turn men into copper, smelting flesh and bone into ingots. No one knew the truth, but everyone sensed it. Something was wrong in Dead Copper Hollow. And the Hartwells encouraged the superstition. When asked about the disappearances, Caleb would shrug and mutter about spirits in the ground. Silas, with his sly smile, would speak of the ore's hunger. They allowed rumor to shield them better than steel. The more haunted the valley seemed, the fewer men came near, and the freer they were to continue their work unseen. But even as the valley emptied of neighbors, the shipments did not stop. Barges downriver bore loads of copper too pure to be explained by natural veins. Traders marveled, but they did not question. Gold and copper alike made men blind. The Hartwells grew rich, and their mine grew deeper. It was around this time that the stories shifted from simple fear to something closer to reverence. A preacher passing through Bardstown claimed the hollow was cursed by God, a wound in the earth for men's sins. Another, more blasphemous rumor held that the Hartwells were not men at all, but emissaries of something older, that the mine was no ordinary vein, but a gateway. The ground bleeds there, one farmer told his neighbors, and they drink it. The strangest accounts came from those few who ventured too close and survived. A woodcutter who skirted the ridge swore he heard singing from underground, low, wavering chants, not in any tongue he knew. A group of hunters reported seeing lanterns moving far inside the mine when no men should have been working at that hour, and one boy who strayed after dusk returned white-haired and mute, clutching a lump of slag in his hand so tightly it had to be pried free. He never spoke again. Pendleton's earlier warnings, buried in forgotten correspondence, resurfaced only as rumor, the doctor who said they mined men. Whether anyone believed it hardly mattered. By then, fear itself had done the Hartwell's work. The hollow had become a boundary. Those who lived near it learned to skirt its edge, to keep their heads down, to pray when the wind carried the mine's breath through the trees. And so, paradoxically, the Hartwells thrived. For the more the hollow was feared, the more it was left alone. The brothers walked into town with copper to trade and left with supplies, their wealth undeniable, their secrecy intact. Men muttered behind their backs, but none dared confront them. Still, the legend spread. By the turn of the century, Dead Copper Hollow was no longer merely a place. It was a story, told in whispers around fires, passed from settler to settler, a story of a valley where men disappeared, where the earth itself was poisoned, where a famine of miners had bargained with something unseen. The truth, the experiments, the ledgers, the autopsies, was darker than any of the folklore. But it was the folklore that endured, and in the Hartwell's eyes, that was its own kind of success. For stories, like copper, could be smelted into something lasting, something eternal. Among the fragments of Hartwell history, none chill the blood more than the ledgers. Bound in thick calfskin, their pages brittle with age, they survived fire, flood, and secrecy to deliver a record unlike anything else from the frontier. They are not diaries in the usual sense, they are not work logs or accounts, they are experiments. The first surviving ledger from 1796 is Caleb's hand throughout, steady, precise, devoid of ornament. He writes with the detachment of a surgeon, the coldness of one who has ceased to see men as men. Each entry is numbered, each subject reduced to a variable. Subject 7, male, approximately 35 years. Initial exposure, mine shaft, 3 hours. Symptoms, dizziness, nausea, discoloration of fingernails. Survival, 4 days. Subject 8, male, approximately 20 years. Exposure extended to 6 hours. Violent emesis, tremors, spasms. Death, 2 days. Autopsy revealed lungs saturated with mineral dust, markedly green in hue. Subject 9, female, mid-40s, captured en route to Lexington. Survived longest to date, 17 days. Remarkable resistance, hair loss, teeth loosened. Final days marked by delirium, during which she spoke incessantly of faces in the walls. The notations grow longer as the numbers rise. By subject 12, Caleb begins sketching diagrams of organs, shaded with ink to indicate where the ore's influence left its marks. By subject 15, he is measuring intervals of heartbeat with a pocket watch, transcribing them with clinical satisfaction. Silas's handwriting appears in the margins, restless, jagged, suggestive of a man half dreaming. His comments reveal a mind less detached than his brother's, but perhaps more dangerous. Next to Caleb's dry measurements of spasms, Silas scrawls, "The body resisting, but bends, there is music in it." Later, beneath a diagram of blackened lungs, he adds, "The ore is not content to kill, it teaches, it remakes." Over time, the ledger ceases to resemble a series of deaths and begins to resemble a curriculum. The Hartwells are not merely cataloguing symptoms, they are seeking patterns, testing dosages, introducing variables, lengthening exposure here, reducing nourishment there, observing whether the body adapts, whether it learns. One section, dated late 1797, stands out. Experiment A, repeated exposure at sublethal doses. Subject endured 6 weeks before collapse. Progress encouraging. Suggests possibility of hereditary transfer if conception occurs during exposure. Here the ink is darker, pressed hard into the page, as if the thought excited Caleb more than any result so far. The ledger becomes fevered, almost visionary. If the mind remakes the body, what of the bloodline? What of the child shaped within a womb that breathes its air? The implications are horrifying, and yet, in the Hartwells' eyes, they were promises. They believed the ore could breed a new lineage, one not poisoned but perfected by its touch. Meanwhile, Silas's additions grew stranger. He began transcribing snatches of speech from delirious subjects, insisting they were not madness but messages. One scrawl reads, "Not hallucination. They describe the same voices. They speak of pressure, of weight, of the stone listening." Another entry beside Caleb's sketch of a skull mottled with green reads simply, "It wants disciples." The ledger's final section from that year bears no subject number, no autopsy notes, only a single line in Caleb's hand. The work will continue until the ore teaches us its full scripture. By the close of 1797, the Hartwells were no longer miners, they were disciples. The ledgers make this transformation plain. The clinical notations of exposure and decay give way to language swollen with awe, as though the brothers had crossed some invisible threshold from science into revelation. It was Caleb who framed the work first in terms of scripture. In one entry, written with a steadiness that belies its madness, he declared, "The shaft is no longer mine, but sanctuary. Each vein is a verse, each collapse of flesh is commentary. We are tasked not with discovery, but with translation." Silas embraced the notion even more fervently. His handwriting, already erratic, swerved into sprawling, near-illegible scrawls. He spoke of the ore as though it breathed, as though it whispered lessons in the groan of timbers and the hiss of poisoned air. One chilling margin note reads, "The stone does not kill, it baptizes. We must learn its hymns." Neighbors, scarce as they were, began to report new disturbances. Strange chanting at night carried down from the ridge, lights moving deep in the shaft long after midnight, the clang of tools when no workers were said to be employed. A teamster passing by at dawn swore he heard what sounded like a congregation singing from underground, dozens of voices rising and falling, though the Hartwells swore they lived alone. The mine itself seemed to change. Visitors who strayed too close described a pressure in the chest, a dizziness that grew worse the deeper they walked into the hollow. Some claimed the walls wept moisture not of water, but of something acrid, metallic. One boy, bold enough to enter the shaft's mouth, emerged moments later retching and blind in one eye, the sclera stained with a faint green ring that never faded. To the Hartwells, these were not warnings, they were confirmations. Caleb noted each occurrence with light. Atmosphere shapes the intruder instantly, proof of the stone's agency. Silas, more mystical, wrote, "It selects, it refuses the unworthy." By 1798, the language of their ledgers bore the unmistakable cadence of scripture. A section titled Doctrina Lapidis, the Doctrine of Stone, includes passages that read less like experiment notes and more like sermons. The ore is not inert matter but memory compressed. Each vein is a sentence of the earth's first tongue. To breathe it is to read it. To die of it is to become part of its gospel. We are not defiled by its touch, but refined, as copper is refined in fire. These writings circulated nowhere in their time, hidden in locked trunks, but later scholars would marvel at their consistency. Two brothers, writing separately, yet converging on the same idea. The mine was alive. It possessed intention, and it had chosen them. Their behavior in town reflected this shift. Caleb grew solemn, speaking less, watching men with a physician's cold eye, as if judging their suitability. Silas, in contrast, became unrestrained, muttering fragments of hymns he claimed the stone had taught him. When pressed by a tavern keeper about the disappearances in the valley, Silas reportedly laughed and said, "The mine is the only graveyard worth tending." By then, Dead Copper Hollow was spoken of not as a haunted place, but as an accursed temple. Preachers warned against it. Mothers forbade their children from walking anywhere near the ridge. Yet the Hartwells remained, lanterns burning all night, their wealth increasing, their solitude deepening, their obsession hardening into creed. The scripture of stone was not yet written in full. To the Hartwells, each subject, each death, was merely another verse awaiting translation. The mine whispered more, always more, and the brothers, fevered and devout, bent their ears to the dark until they heard nothing else. By 1799, the hollow no longer echoed with the ring of pickaxes, but with voices. The Hartwells had abandoned pretense of mining altogether. Instead, they gathered what they called a congregation, not of volunteers, but of captives. Travelers gone missing near the ridge, farmhands who wandered too close, drifters taken from taverns, all were brought below. Their chains clinked against the stone as the brothers arranged them in rough circles deep inside the shaft. Lanterns cast long shadows across faces pale from hunger and dust. Caleb presided like a minister. He read from the ledger as though from a pulpit, reciting symptoms and deaths with the cadence of scripture. He commanded the captives to inhale, to kneel, to endure the air until their lungs rattled. He called it the litany of endurance. Silas provided the pageantry. He daubed ore-stained slurry across their foreheads, declaring them anointed. He led call and response chants, forcing the weakened voices into unison. The stone endures. The flesh bends. If one faltered, he struck them with a rod until the words spilled broken from their lips. The captives did not last long. Some coughed themselves bloody within days. Others collapsed, twitching, their skin green-tinged, their eyes wide and sightless. But their deaths only deepened the brothers' devotion. Each corpse was a verse, each gasp of agony, a hymn. Whispers of this congregation drifted downriver, carried by those few who escaped or by neighbors who heard the chanting at night. Yet no one dared intervene. The Hollow's reputation as cursed proved a stronger barrier than any weapon, and so the congregation grew and perished unseen. In one chilling ledger entry, Caleb wrote, "We are no longer two, we are many. Their voices join ours in the hymn eternal. Their breath feeds the scripture, their silence completes it." The mine had become a church. Its altar was the pit, its pews were chains, and its God, if such a word could apply, was not a figure of heaven, but a whispering pressure in the stone, a presence that promised eternity in exchange for devotion, sacrifice, and silence. In the spring of 1800, Dead Copper Hollow shuddered, whether by accident, design, or the will of the stone itself. The deepest chamber of the Hartwell's mine caved in. A dozen captives were below when the timbers split. Their screams carried up the shaft as walls of ore and shale folded inward. Lanterns burst, plunging the chamber into blackness. The air filled with choking dust, with the sound of rock grinding upon rock like the closing of a great jaw. Caleb stood at the edge of the collapse, ledger in hand, recording every moment even as the ceiling roared down. His notes describe it without panic. Subject voices rise to chorus, chamber consumed, dust heavy, luminous in lantern glow, pressure immense, the stone speaks louder than ever. Silas reacted differently. Witnesses claim they heard him shouting praises, calling the cave-in a sacrifice demanded by the ore. He clawed at the rubble with his bare hands, bloodied, laughing, urging the captives to continue their chanting, even as their cries turned to silence. When the dust cleared days later, the Hartwells did not mourn. They marked the event as holy. Caleb titled the entry simply, "The First Collapse." Beneath it, Silas scrawled, "Every scripture requires its martyrdom." The hollow bore the wound visibly. A new scar of earth slumped down the ridge, trees toppled, the mine's mouth half swallowed. Locals who dared pass nearby swore the air smelled worse than ever, not just metallic, but charnel, like open graves in summer. Rather than abandon their work, the brothers called it consecrated ground. The mine had chosen, had killed, had devoured. To them, it proved the scripture was true, and the congregation, though buried, was not lost, for in their eyes the stone had merely taken its first communion. Dr. Marcus Pendleton returned to the valley in the autumn of 1800, summoned not by invitation, but by the persistence of rumor. Word of the collapse had reached Lexington, whispers of dozens entombed, of chanting beneath the ridge, of brothers who called ruin sacrament. His conscience, gnawed for years, dragged him back. He found the hollow transformed. Where once a mining camp stood, now only silence lingered. The shaft's mouth was half choked by rubble, timbers jutting like ribs from a grave. Yet at night, Pendleton swore he heard voices still, faint, muffled, as though the buried captives had not ceased their hymns. The Hartwells greeted him with unsettling calm. Caleb appeared gaunt, ink staining his fingers, eyes burning with sleepless intensity. Silas, hair unkempt, bore his arms raw from digging in the collapsed chamber, as if still trying to free the dead. Neither expressed regret. Instead, they thanked the doctor for returning, declaring that the stone had called him. Pendleton recoiled at what he saw. The brothers had carved symbols along the cabin walls, circles intersected by jagged veins, meant to mimic the branching of ore. The air reeked of decay and copper. He demanded they abandon the place, threatened to report them to every magistrate in the territory. But Caleb only raised his ledger. "You misunderstand, Doctor," he said. "It was never a mine. It is scripture, and scripture demands readers." Pendleton left in haste, heart sickened, yet he could not resist making one final note in his journal. His last surviving page reads, "The hollow does not bury its dead. It digests them, and the Hartwells, blind and blessed, mistake consumption for communion." In the summers of 1801 and 1802, the valley suffered what later records call the fever years. Some claimed it was yellow fever carried upriver. Others whispered it was the mine itself, breathing contagion into the air. Families along the Kentucky River fell ill in clusters. Skin yellowed, eyes sank, fevers burned high, and the graveyards filled too quickly for the stones to be carved. Yet amid this sickness, the Hartwells endured untouched. They walked into Lexington markets pale but strong, purchasing supplies while others staggered half-delirious. Their health in a season of pestilence was so conspicuous that whispers turned into accusations. "The hollow shields them," townsfolk muttered. "The brothers drink poison and call it blessing." Caleb encouraged the rumors. He spoke to those desperate for cures, claiming the ore had taught them endurance. He offered tinctures mixed with crushed green mineral, vials sold at exorbitant price. Some buyers swore the drafts worked for a time, others died quicker after swallowing them. To Caleb, both outcomes were confirmations. Silas, meanwhile, prowled the sickbeds. He pressed damp foreheads, muttered fragments of scripture, whispered that the fever itself was a test, the stone choosing its flock. When families turned him away, he laughed and said the mine would not forgive their refusal. By winter, the epidemic waned, but its memory clung. Entire households were gone. Survivors bore strange marks, green-tinged nails, brittle teeth, coughs that lingered. Many blamed the hollow, but none dared approach the ridge to prove it. For the Hartwells, the fever years were proof of election. Where others wasted, they thrived. Where others buried children, they wrote hymns. In their ledgers, Caleb noted coldly, "The ore preserves its own." Silas added beneath, "The fever was but a choir, and we the only ones who knew the song." By 1803, rumors darkened into something stranger. Whispers spread of a child born in dead Copper Hollow, not to any wife or widow, but to the hollow itself. The tale began with a midwife from Estill County who claimed she was summoned by night to the ridge. She never named who called her, only that the Hartwells met her at the shaft's mouth with lanterns, their faces wild with urgency. She swore she descended into the mine, deeper than she thought possible, until she came to a chamber lined with crude symbols and lit by dozens of flickering lamps. There, upon a blanket of ore dust, a child had already been delivered. The brothers insisted it had emerged from the stone. The midwife described it as frail, mottled green at the fingertips, its breathing ragged yet strangely steady. Its eyes, she said, opened too soon for a newborn, wide, staring, unblinking. She tried to carry the infant away, but Silas blocked her path, muttering that the hollow had given its heir and that no outsider could raise it. Caleb wrote furiously in his ledger, calling the event the first true revelation. The midwife escaped only days later, half mad with fear, raving in Lexington taverns. Some dismissed her story as delirium. Others swore they heard faint cries from the hollow at night, rising with the wind like a babe's wail muffled by stone. No record of the child survives, no grave, no christening, no name. Yet the rumor persisted, passed in hushed tones, that the mine had birthed flesh of its own, and that the Hartwells were raising it below as priest-kings would tend a holy relic. And if the child lived, the hollow was no longer merely a scripture, it had become a lineage. In 1805, the hollow went quiet. For nearly a decade, neighbors and wanderers alike had reported signs of life upon the ridge. The echo of chanting, the glow of lanterns, the acrid tang of smoke and dust carried on the wind. But that year, without warning, all signs ceased. No lights, no hymns, no Hartwells in the markets. Those who braved the slope found the cabin abandoned, its shutters hung loose, its hearth cold, its walls carved over and over with the same jagged symbols, some so deeply etched the boards splintered. The ledgers, once obsessively guarded, were gone. Only scraps of paper remained, torn pages littered with fragments, half a hymn here, half a formula there. The mine itself yawned in silence. The air still stung, still pressed on the chest, but there were no chains, no bodies, no sound but the dripping of unseen water. A few men claimed they dared to enter, lanterns trembling, and reached chambers blackened with soot. As though fires had burned long and slow, they found traces of bedding, gnawed bones, and a crude cradle fashioned from a hollowed beam. But no Hartwells, no child. Speculation multiplied. Some said the brothers had been swallowed whole in another collapse, entombed with their scripture. Others swore they had gone deeper than the shaft itself, tunneling into chambers where no daylight could follow. A wilder rumor insisted they had walked into the earth alive, following the child of the hollow into its rightful kingdom. For 2 full years, dead Copper Hollow lay still. Travelers avoided it. Preachers declared the silence proof of God's final judgment, yet a few, braver or more foolish, whispered another truth, that silence is not peace, but waiting, and the hollow, they said, was only holding its breath. In the winter of 1807, the silence broke. Hunters on the ridge were the first to speak of it. They claimed they saw a glow rising from the shaft at night, not the steady flame of lanterns, but a pulse, as though the stone itself had learned to breathe with light. The air, they said, rang faintly, like a hammer striking a far-off bell. By spring, livestock in the nearby farms grew restless. Horses refused to approach the ridge, their eyes rolling white. Cattle bellowed through the night, coughing froth that glistened green in the morning sun. Children in the valley woke screaming, swearing they heard voices calling their names from beneath the ground. When bold men ascended to the cabin, they found it no longer abandoned. Smoke curled once again from the chimney. Fresh carvings marked the doorframe. Circles upon circles, their grooves packed with ground ore. Inside, a new ledger rested open on the table. The handwriting was Caleb's, though tighter, more fevered. The first entry read only, 2 years in silence. Now the stone sings. We sing with it. Witnesses swore they glimpsed movement at the mine's mouth, a figure taller than either Hartwell, shrouded in a cloak of patched canvas, carrying something bundled close. The sound of weeping, too high, too thin for a man's voice, echoed briefly, then was gone. The brothers had returned, it seemed, but changed. They no longer visited the markets, no longer spoke with neighbors. Their presence was known only by the pulsing glow and the muffled cries that seeped from the earth on windless nights. The hollow had reawakened, and whatever it had birthed during its silence now stirred with it. By 1808, patience in the valley had worn thin. The Hartwell's silence had once been welcome, but their re-emergence filled the air with dread. Families who had long endured their presence began to speak openly. Something must be done. The first stirrings of vigilance came from church pulpits. Preachers denounced the hollow as a den of abomination, declaring that no Christian soil should suffer such profanation. If God's wrath be slow, one thundered, then let men's hands hasten his justice. Neighbors formed watch groups, taking turns keeping lanterns lit at the edges of their farms, rifles close. Hunters avoided the ridge, yet reported strange tracks crossing frozen ground, barefoot, human-shaped, but too small, too narrow, as if belonging to a child that walked alone in the night. One farmer's daughter swore she saw figures moving along the ridgeline at dusk, carrying a lantern that pulsed rather than flickered. Another claimed that a thin, reedy voice whispered through his shutters, repeating his name until he cried out to Christ. The neighbors spoke of marching to the hollow as a body, of sealing the shaft forever with fire and powder, but fear divided them. What if the mine collapsed again and released something worse? What if the Hartwells resisted, as madmen often do, and dragged more down with them? Still, resolve hardened. Notes survive from a meeting held in a tavern in Estill County, men swearing oaths to confront the brothers, to put an end to their scripture, to free the valley of its curse. Yet, as the neighbors prepared, the hollow seemed to sense the attention. The glow grew stronger, the cries louder, the ridge waited, and the Hartwells, though unseen, were watching too. On an autumn night in 1808, the neighbors gathered, 20 men, some with rifles, some with farm tools, all with torches held high. They marched up the ridge, prayers on their lips, fear hard in their eyes. Children and wives watched from below, lanterns flickering like stars against the valley dark. The climb was slow, the air thick with the iron tang that always hung around the hollow. As they neared the cabin, the ground trembled faintly as if something beneath shifted in restless sleep. Still they pressed on, torches cutting against the black. The cabin stood waiting, smoke spilling from its chimney. Its windows glowed faintly, though no shapes moved inside. When they drew close, they found the door ajar, the symbols carved deeper than before, grooves filled with some dark resin that stank of copper and rot. The men shouted for the Hartwells to show themselves. Their voices echoed, then faded, swallowed by the shaft's gaping mouth. No reply came, only a distant sound from below, rhythmic and low, like chanting muffled by tons of stone. Braver men entered the cabin. They found no food, no bedding, no sign of ordinary life, only ledgers, stacked high, their pages black with cramped handwriting, and on the table, a small cradle, empty, its wood darkened as if it had been soaked in ore. The men stood frozen in that cabin, torchlight flickering over ledgers and cradle, the muffled chant swelling beneath their boots. Some urged retreat, but others, prideful, terrified, unwilling to return empty-handed, pressed on. They carried their torches to the mine's mouth, its timbers black with age and smoke. The chanting grew clearer, now layered, as though many voices sang at once, weaving a hymn too low for words, yet too vast to ignore. Against their better judgment, they descended. The shaft swallowed them quickly. The deeper they went, the stronger the smell, copper, sulfur, and something else, something rancid and sweet. Walls glistened with veins of ore that seemed to pulse faintly in the torchlight, like vessels beneath skin. At the lowest chamber they found what remained of the congregation. Rows of figures sat against the walls, their bodies stiff, their flesh mottled green and black. Mouths hung open, yet from those mouths the chanting poured, endless and unbroken, as if the ore itself used their throats to sing. At the center stood the Hartwells. Caleb clutched his ledger, his eyes wild but unseeing, as if he no longer recorded but only received. Silas knelt beside the cradle, which no longer lay empty. Within it stirred a shape too small for a man, yet too wrong for a child, its skin pale as ore dust, its fingers hooked like roots. The thing opened its eyes, wide, green-lit, ancient, and the chamber shook. What happened next is uncertain. Some say the men fled, and those who returned never spoke again. Others claim no one came back, that the ridge itself consumed them. By spring, the shaft had collapsed, the cabin rotted, the trail overgrown. But valley folk swore the chanting lingered, faint on quiet nights, drifting from the ridge like smoke, and in every generation since, someone has vanished near dead Copper Hollow. The scripture was never finished. It waits still beneath the earth, written in veins of stone and the silence between heartbeats. And it waits for readers,